This podcast is made possible by the kind contributions of listeners like you. A small donation helps me to put the show together. I do try to give something extra to patrons through Patreon or a newsletter to those who have donated via PayPal. If you enjoy the show, please visit patreon.com/WW2podcast or www2podcast.com for details. A small recurring donation goes a long way. Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. I have enough of a back catalogue of podcasts now that some topics brush into one another. Hopefully it makes them more enjoyable. From my point of view, it certainly makes it more fun to do, and I think they have a greater depth. This is one such topic. We're looking at women in the secret services, the OSS and SOE during the war. Women played a crucial role, a number operating in the field as agents, where it was easier for them to blend in occupied countries than perhaps young men of military age. I'm joined by Greg Lewis. With Gordon Thomas, he is the author of Shadow Warriors of World War II, The Daring Women of the OSS and SOE. Greg, thanks for joining me. If we start before the war, had women been employed by the secret services?
No, they hadn't really. I mean, there is a history of women involved in spying, I suppose, going back to certainly the American Civil War, the First World War. But the actual recruitment of women as agents by British Secret Service hadn't been done in any real capacity in the way that it was in the Second World War. At the start of the war, you've got the military and the intelligence services. Women aren't on their radar at all, If you put your sort of social history hat on for a moment, women in the early part of the 20th century, they're very much in the home or they're in somebody else's home as domestic servants, when this is first discussed, whether women should be used as agents, there's sort of some people think, well, they're not capable of it. And others think they just shouldn't be involved in any way at all. But when you get to, as I'm sure many of your contributors have talked about before, when you get to sort of the summer of 1940, June 1940, Britain is probably at its lowest point in the war. That will be the lowest point in the war. You've got Western Europe totally under the Nazi jackboot. You've got the Soviet Union still allied with Germany, and you've got the Americans not yet in the war, so Britain feels very much alone. So it takes people in the intelligence service. There's got to be people there who've got to think slightly differently, outside the box, as we would say now in that pretty awful phrase, and you don't really have that at the start of the war. You have the same very kind of upper class people running the intelligence services. Then you have Churchill come in, and Churchill sees that he's got MI6, he's got the code breakers, but he realized that he wants something more. And if you think about the way we gathered intelligence in Western Europe at the start of the war, what MI6 really had was a series of agents in the passport offices in the big cities. Once the Germans overrun France, Holland, Belgium, all that network is gone. So immediately we have to start rethinking how we're going to get intelligence from inside occupied Europe. And of course, when Churchill sort of decides that he needs something other than the intelligence gatherers of MI6, he needs a very proactive organization that's going to lead sabotage, is going to recruit local people in occupied countries, and the word goes out, and SOE is what comes of this. You then have a slightly different group of people in positions of power in intelligence. You have people who are capable of thinking about something different, Many of them are still from the same kind of social groups, but they've been involved in guerrilla warfare. They've seen guerrilla warfare in Ireland. They've seen it in Russia at the end of the First World War. So they're thinking differently. At the same time, you have a number of refugees coming over from France and Holland and Belgium, people who've escaped the Nazis, and they're arriving in London. So you have this little wealth of people who speak the languages of the occupied nations who are there in Britain. And you think, well, we can make use of these people, So when SOE starts thinking about what they can do, they start thinking about the agents that they can send back in. Obviously, they think, well, there are many women among these people. And so the women become very important, and they become important pretty much from the beginning. People like Selwyn Jepson realize that women can do jobs that men cannot, in a way, or they can do jobs better, really, because of the conditions on the ground. So if you have an occupied nation and you have young men roaming around, the occupiers are looking at them saying, what do they do? And they're immediately suspicious of them. And also you have the fact that the Germans are just as sniffy about women being agents as the British. So in the early years of SOE, 1940, 41, 42, the Germans are very reluctant to believe that a woman is an agent or is a wireless operator or is a courier. So that works in their favour as well. So there are many reasons, and as the war goes on, there's greater recognition that the work that women are doing is essential to SOE, and then later to the OSS, the Americans as well.
It hadn't really occurred to me, in actual fact, that young men roving around the countryside, up to a point, were out of place, because young men were either removed for forced labour in Germany, or they'd be imprisoned, and so actually young men stand out like a sore thumb. So how did they recruit the women? How do they find people? It's a very difficult thing to find people without giving them away.
Well, that's true. It is, and it's partly to do with the fact that you have the people coming in from the occupied countries, and when they come in from France in particular, many of the people who will go in to work for SOE had been involved in the early years of the resistance. Before the resistance became aggressively started fighting back, a lot of people were involved in evasion lines. Firstly, taking out soldiers who might have been trapped after Dunkirk, and then also taking out airmen who had been shot down in France and Belgium. Obviously, these became very well-organised structures in their own right later in the war. Comet Line, for instance, which is based around Brussels, with women, at the heart. A Comet Line was run by a woman, But many of those people eventually had to escape themselves through France, particularly after the Germans went into the Vichy area in late 1942. That changed a lot of what was happening with the evasion lines. It changed a lot of what was happening with the resistance, and it would have a lot of effect on SOE and OSS when the Germans took over the whole of France. But also, many of the women would find themselves serving as WAFs, when they were filling in their forms. They would be talking about their knowledge of foreign languages, French in particular here we're talking about. So this would find its way to the War Office. The War Office and SOE would contact people, say, come in and talk to us. They also had made these appeals for anybody who had knowledge of France, postcards from France, relatives in France, so they could build up an idea of the French coastline and defences. So people would come in. SOE interviewed people in different places, men and women in different places. But everybody who came in would be assessed as to whether they were suitable. Their French would be checked. Particularly in the early days, they were looking at people who had very good language skills. Later on, the language skills, people went into the field with almost schoolgirl French,
Hello.
which we're all sort of familiar with, and that became one of the problems that developed later on. But early on, they were looking at people who were half French or French-born, or had spent a lot of time in France. They would be told, are you prepared to go back to France? Everybody had the opportunity to say no. So all the women who would be interviewed, particularly, and we're talking about young women, but we're often talking about young mums as well. That's one of the additional things you get with the female story, really, is that idea, the bond between mother and child, being very special. And there are women such as Odette Sanson and Violette Szabo who are mums. It's quite heartbreaking to think of what that decision they must have made to leave their children behind. And people like Violette, of course, sadly didn't come back.
That surprised me. I hadn't realised there was there were mothers. I presumed they just picked single women because they were also married. Some of them were married and left husbands as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose it's kind of sexist of us to sort of be discussing things like that because obviously many of the men involved in war would be fathers as well. But we sort of think about it with the mums, and particularly as we're in a situation here now where we're turning women into combatants effectively. Obviously SOE has three main roles an agent would have. A network leader, a wireless operator, and a courier. And obviously, if you look at the structure of the networks, there was obviously a feeling remained that a network leader had to be a man. It was the men who led the networks, but the wireless operators, which is perhaps the most dangerous job, and the couriers were very often women, and women became very adept at this role, particularly because they could move around, as we sort of hinted at earlier. And Selwyn Jepson just felt they were better at it anyway. He just felt they were better couriers. He said they were just better at living this life. If we were to talk about the wireless operator job, I mean, one of the things that the wireless operator had to do, which made it very, very difficult, was not just the process of sending the messages, but the moving between locations. They couldn't stay at one location for very long. They had to get their radio to the place they were going to transmit from. And while you're traveling with a radio, it's a small suitcase, and you're traveling through checkpoints and all the rest of it. So it's a very dangerous job because it's very hard to lie your way out of what you're doing if somebody opens your suitcase. So women sometimes had an advantage there because they could possibly get away with more excuse about having a bag with them. And they also, as some of the agents in our book did, they could talk their way through checkpoints sometimes a little bit better, because the male soldiers could be more susceptible to their charms, really, and to being chatted. There's an agent, an Irish agent known as Paddy O'Sullivan, very, very attractive, very full of energy and courage. She twice talked her way through checkpoints. Once she agreed to go on a date with one of the soldiers, and she never kept the date. And another time, somebody said, one of the soldiers said, "What's in the bag?" And she said, "Oh, a wireless, a radio, And he said, "Oh, yeah," and sent her along her way, which is incredible gall and courage. But a man wouldn't get away with that, And I think that what they showed, the women showed, there was no reason why they couldn't be every bit as good as men. There was they had disadvantages perhaps, but they also had advantages, So overall, I think the role they played was every bit as essential as any man. And of course, some women went on to effectively become network leaders. People like Pearl Witherington and Nancy Wake. Nancy Wake, who took part in an operation to raid a Gestapo headquarters and threw a grenade into a room and all that kind of swashbuckling soldiery stuff. Some of them went on to do that kind of work as well. So they were incredibly courageous, and they played every bit of the part they were asked to do.
Did they have the same training as the men?
Yes, essentially they did. At the start, there was a kind of feeling that they wouldn't be able to do all the training, And if you look, there's some stories that we uncovered. If you look, there was a lot of initially. Certainly, there was a real sexism running through some of the trainers as well. There was a lady called Yolanda Beekman who became an excellent agent, an excellent wireless operator. But her instructor in the instructor's report, he described her as a nice girl who darned the men's socks, would make an excellent wife for an unimaginative man. Not even an imaginative man. And this is what he wrote about her. And this is a woman who went on to become a wireless operator for what was the Musician Network in the northeast of France. Very, very brave, sent an incredible number of messages back to Britain. She worked for an agent called Gustave Bieler, who was a very, very active organizer of sabotage in Saint-Quentin in northeastern France. Blew up locomotive sheds and he blew up the canal gates at Saint-Quentin, which was a very important part of the network for German munitions movement and all this. She was arrested eventually, and she was executed in Dachau, very sadly, with Bila. And so it just shows, that at the start, when the instructors are very, very sexist about the way they viewed the girls, but that changed as well. That changed. They realised eventually that these people were very courageous. You have to bear in mind, these men hadn't seen anything like this before. They hadn't seen women coming in to do training with knives and unarmed combat and how to garrote sentries. They hadn't seen a woman with a Sten gun, so it was hard for them.
Yeah, well, presumably, a lot of the male recruits have come through some sort of army background, even if they hadn't been in very long. But some of these women have an amazing, what might now, in a post-war world you might have referred to as a jet set background. They seem to have been very international. They've lived everywhere. They've had some incredible jobs from very affluent families, and to sort of parachute them. You wouldn't have expected them to do well in that military. Certainly, the training regime. You'd have thought they'd have all failed.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. Interestingly, and this works two ways actually. If you look at it sort of from another sort of social perspective, yes, you have a lot of women who come in there from very middle class backgrounds. Like you say, they've parents who are diplomats or bankers or something, something from that strata of society, if you want to term like that. But you also have an awful lot of very working class women, and that's different for these people in the intelligence services as well. You have French working class people, so there's that sort of prejudice as well, because the spy's role, traditionally the spy's role, it's been, if you look back to the First World War and the men involved, they're public school, as we later found out, as it continued, but yeah. Not always for the best. No, that's right. But you're talking about people very often who are working class, so there's that some of them had to overcome a sort of double prejudice in a way, and then you have people like you say, people who travel, like people like Virginia Hall, the American, who had wanted to be part of the...
She had one leg, didn't she?
She did. No, she's one of the great... She's
absolutely incredible.
Incredible, like you say, incredible. She was from a very, very good background in Baltimore, I think, and she saw herself as having a career in the Foreign Service, the American Foreign Service, and she's one of the people you mentioned, really, who travelled extensively in the 1930s, spent a lot of time in Europe, and during this time, she had a hunting accident where a gun went off and very, very bad wound, and she had her left leg amputated below the knee. She had a prosthetic leg, a false leg, which she nicknamed Cuthbert. And I think, just from that little part of the story, I think you get an idea of the woman, the strength of her, also the personality. She's very interesting from our perspective because she links SOE and OSS, the British and the American, because she's in France when the war breaks out, and she spends a lot of time there. She has some connections with journalism, which a number of agents do. Journalism sort of is an information gathering profession, and so a lot of them tend to have links to journalism, perhaps more than other professions. She starts off in France. She comes to London. She goes back as a journalist for SOE. She travels around Vichy France. She's collecting information. She is actually filing stories. And then once the Germans go into Vichy France, across the demarcation line, she comes back out. When she comes back, obviously the Americans are in the war, and then she goes to work for the Americans, or OSS, and she becomes one of their main agents in France in the run up to D-Day. Very, very important agent. And interestingly, what she does is she uses her disability to her advantage. Before she goes back into France, she kind of perfects this sort of image as an older woman. She uses the limp. She develops this sort of hunched kind of appearance, old clothes, and she spends a lot of time in the countryside as a sort of a peasant woman, doing all sorts of stuff in hay fields with cows, but all the time she's watching, she's counting the military vehicles going past, and then she's off into barns, and she's radioing back to OSS, which is obviously based in London for these purposes. So she's an incredible woman.
What's the wireless transmission about shooting Cuthbert? There's a wireless exchange about it, isn't it? About a leg.
because of course, when she escapes over the Pyrenees, I think it must be end of 42, early 43. It's a 48-hour walk, over these mountains. And of course, she's worried about Cuthbert and they don't know what she means, but she's worried about the fact. And when she gets over, I think, the stump of her leg is bleeding and in terrible, it's an arduous trek that is for the airmen that used to do it through the evasion line. So for her, it's incredibly brave woman. And of course, she, goes on to be an officer in the CIA after the Second World War, and suffers a little bit of sexism there. Well, she suffers doubly a little bit again, I think, because she's a woman and because she has such an incredible history in the Second World War. Some of the other people back in America feel a little bit intimidated by that. So I don't think she rose to the ranks that other people, she might have done had things been different.
Well, the OSS was a peculiar organisation that, it's shut down straight away post-war because of inter-service rivalry, and I wonder if some of that had, been an OSS hangover.
I think you're quite right in a way. I think because obviously SOE suffered a similar sort of fate. It was almost like we've let these people who aren't quite cricket, they're not quite right. They're okay during the war, but now the war's over, let's gain back control, and it goes back into the familiar sort of people start running intelligence services as well. Although on OSS, I think that definitely happened. It happened to Donovan, didn't it? That he was kind of. But Alan Dulles came out very well. Alan Dulles ran OSS from Bern in Switzerland, and he went on to be the director of the CIA.
Did the Americans, the OSS, did they look for different things when they were recruiting women, or did they just copy the British model?
They were following the British in a way. Americans were caught off guard a little bit intelligence-wise by Pearl Harbor. They realized very quickly they need to do something about that. Roosevelt is close to Donovan. Bill Donovan is a very resourceful man with very good contacts. First World War hero, a kind of a lawyer, intelligent, knows a lot of people, has good connections in Britain and, good connections in Europe. He travels around Europe and he sees what MI6 and SOE are doing and he wants a bit of that, He loves the idea of running agents, of having that kind of clandestine network and organisation. And Roosevelt says, go for it. I think, obviously, the British have the advantage of geographically. The early refugees are coming into Britain, so they have that pool straight away to go for. What the Americans do is worth pointing out is that they use a lot of women in behind the scenes. Donovan's office, there's a lot of very important women there who are selecting agents in the same way. Britain does that as well, obviously, but Vera Atkins, obviously, in the SOE is a key figure. And so women are not just agents in this structure. They're part of the training. They are very much part of the organisation. And obviously they're part of all things to do with black propaganda and things like that. Donovan's view of everything was anything that'll beat the Hun is good by me. Because obviously one of the things that OSS did was they looked for left-wing people, people who would oppose the Germans. They were a little bit more open to them than the British, I think. They were a little bit more open to, obviously, many of the people inside Germany who opposed the Nazis were communists, I think the Americans, funnily enough, tended to be more open to them than the British. Obviously, with America, you've got the fact that MI6, before the Americans entered the war, are running the British Security Coordination, the BSC, which you've probably come across, which is a very fascinating organisation, effectively being used on a potential ally, Firstly, to try and persuade the Americans that joining the war would be a good thing,
And they were funding campaigns secretly, advertising campaigns and trying to cajole through news and things to try and persuade the population to enter the war. It's a very and the Americans kind of knew about it as well, didn't they? There was a sort of a they turned a blind eye to it, sort of thing.
I think they knew. They knew obviously the BSC. They knew the BSC was there because the BSC had had a front, really, in the sense that it was there just to inform Americans about the war, So they knew there was a certain amount going on. I don't think they knew everything that was going on, because I think the BSC very much wanted to use all manners of work to persuade the Americans, the public, the American public, but also Roosevelt. I mean, I think Roosevelt was probably... he needed to persuade his politicians, really, So it was a very, very interesting time. One of the agents, Betty Pack, she comes through the story from MI6 to BSC to OSS, effectively, because Betty's one of the agents who, she never handles a gun. She doesn't go to the commando school in Scotland. She's not that agent. She is more along that sort of agent, the femme fatale agent. She's very, very attractive. She's from a very, very good family. She's married to a British diplomat, and she finds herself in Spain during the Civil War. And it's there she first crosses the radar of MI6. Her husband is a senior diplomat in Spain. She starts running messages, and at one point it's not entirely sure which side she's on, because both sides think she's actually on the other side. MI6 do eventually say she is actually spying on Franco. I mean, the British government was not sure what side it was on, I suppose, in the Spanish Civil War. And then MI6, they do an interesting thing that happens where Betty Pack's husband, Arthur, gets moved to Warsaw in the run-up to the Second World War, 37, 38. And obviously, MI6 felt he can be of more use there now. This is where things are happening, And at the time, for instance, although the British weren't quite sure what the Poles were going to do, because they thought maybe that some agreement would be had between the Germans and the Poles, and bits of land would be carved up between them. And they knew the Poles had an Enigma machine, which the British at the time were still keen to crack. So Betty was there in Warsaw, and Betty's sort of MO, if you like, is get close to men who are important and sleep with them. She did this with great aplomb. And she seemed to really like them as well. The funny thing is that she did actually sort of like the people that she built up these relationships with. Of course, men had secrets, Men were the one who had the secrets. So it seems a natural thing to do is to send a pretty woman to get them. It's the story. It's a familiar story of spying, isn't it? And she did that in Poland. And then, of course, she ends up back in the United States with the British Security Coordination, with William Stevenson. It's there then that she is involved in all sorts of spying on US territory.
She's the one involved in the French embassy burglary?
That's right. The Vichy...
Great.
Yeah, it is great. It's great because obviously Vichy France is effectively recognised by the United States. We don't really sort of realise that as a nation in a way. So it has a diplomatic presence in America. So they have an embassy and they have control of a large navy, the French Navy. And so what the British really, really need is the naval codes, because this is going to be absolutely essential in the Mediterranean and what's going to be the forthcoming invasion in North Africa. So Betty is there. She gets a mission. She has to try and find a way to get the codes from the Vichy France code from the embassy. She befriends a man called Charles Bruce, who is a diplomat there. And typical Betty, she not only befriends him, she really falls in love with him, Eventually these people, they're going to be together. And what she does, she realizes that he's not sure about the way that the Vichy administration is dealing with Nazi Germany, and she brings him in on the operation. So he knows what's going to happen. What they need to do is they need to get into the embassy, and they need to get into the safe, and they need to copy the code. They don't want the Vichy French government to know the codes have been... They don't want to steal the codes, they want to copy them, because they don't want to know they've been broken. So Betty and Charles, they kind of advertise their relationship to the guards at the embassy. They spend evenings at the embassy so that the guards become familiar with them hanging around in the embassy. They get lessons in cracking safes. And so the night the operation goes ahead, they're in the room. They've they've got access to the safe. An OSS agent is outside the window of the embassy. They pass the codes to him. He runs off to a hotel. In the hotel, they've set up a whole room of cameras and everything, where they just photographing these files overnight. In the meantime, Betty and Charles, of course, has to stay in the embassy, and the guard is roaming around. And the guard is coming to the room where they are, and of course, if he comes to the room, he'll see the room beyond. He'll see that they've got into the code room. So the guard opens the door. Betty, as quick as a flash, has stripped off her clothes and thrown herself into Charles's arms. And so the guard comes in, shines a torch into the room, and there's Betty with virtually nothing on, very attractive. He's a Frenchman, this guard, so he realizes, he doesn't need to be told what's going on. He says good night, and he leaves them to it. And so the whole night they're free. The codes come back. They put the codes away, and these are really important codes. They're the French Navy codes, and they really help with our activities in the Mediterranean. So Betty, she's the other side of the agent. She is an agent who is using her femininity, completely using her femininity. They had thought about sending her into France after this, but they didn't. And it's very fortunate that they didn't, because after her work in the United States, she was effectively blown. And if she'd gone into France, she probably would have been arrested. So she survived the war. But she's a fascinating character. And she sort of said, she sort of said, it's amazing how easily men can be made to give up their secrets once they're in bed. So she's interesting in so many ways.
Yeah. Should we look at those that get flown in by small planes, Lysander or they're parachuted in? I mean, how do these earlier in the war insertions, sort of early missions go? I mean, how did they select the women for the missions, or did their number came up and they went?
I think they had to go through the different kinds of training, the commando training, the parachute training, field craft. They had to understand what life was like in occupied France, because even those that were French who had left in 1940, by 1942, 1943, things had changed. The way you acted changed. Many of the English-born agents had just little interesting things to understand, which they didn't always get taught in Britain. They had to sort of learn on the hoof when they got there. For instance, things like wearing a watch. Many of them were posing as farm workers, peasant workers. They wouldn't wear a watch. Things like that. Also, there's a lady called Yvonne Comeau who went on to be a very, very good wireless operator. She said one of the things she learned when she went, which she hadn't been taught, nobody had ever thought of this, she was eating soup, and she was eating it like daintily out of the side of her spoon. And there's no French country lady who's going to, it was, you got to get it down as fast as you can. Little things like that would give you away. Little things like, looking the wrong way when you cross the road. If a Gestapo agent saw that, just little things. So they all went through that. And then obviously it was felt they were ready to go. When the right role, when a certain network needed a wireless operator, or they were developing a new network, very often the potential network leader, a man, and the potential network wireless operator, a woman, would go in together. As networks grew, they'd need a second wireless operator, they'd need more couriers. Wireless operators had to be trained back at home in London, in Britain. So they would end up being, another woman would go in. So sometimes there'd be two wireless operators and more. And then couriers could be recruited on the ground. I mean, one of the main things for SOE was building a network, So it would start with people who'd come from Britain, trained in Britain. But the idea was to make connections with the French resistance. So you had a sabotage network to organise people, essentially with an eye on when we were going to go back into France. When we were going to open the second front. So they would be picked, trained. They would go in sometimes by parachute, sometimes by Lysander small aircraft, and when they got there, then they would build up their networks. They would identify landing grounds for other agents. They would. So that was a very important part of the job. They would build up the networks with sometimes with people that they'd known before the war. Otherwise, they were just approaching people blind. It was a very, very, very precarious thing to do, because you just didn't know whether somebody had changed their mind, somebody was too frightened to take part in resistance activity, and you didn't know whether you risked betrayal. And of course, that happened to an awful lot of agents. Sometimes because SOE slipped up, other times because it was just such a dangerous thing. How do you know who you're approaching? How do you know if they're safe to approach? So
that whole thing was Henri Dericourt. There was a double agent who basically gave them all up. That was quite early on, and it was real because at the German time the Abwehr was doing well against the Dutch, the Netherlands with the England game. So again, they rolled us up quite well in France early on.
Yeah, absolutely, and. Like you say, the England game, the radio game that the Germans played absolutely effectively in Holland, they did it in France as well. And it was something that I think SOE could have identified it earlier, I think that, the first couple of agents to be caught up in this, the game is, effectively you arrest a wireless operator. You find out how the wireless operator identifies themselves, and you use their wireless. It's a German operator now, but you're pretending to be that agent. That's how it works. It's a brilliantly simple thing to do. I suppose it's hard to identify, but once you have the wireless, once the Germans are running the wireless, they know where munitions are going to be dropped, and they know where agents are going to be dropped. When they know where agents are going to be dropped, they either can arrest them or they can follow them. And they can watch as they build up networks, and then they can blow whole networks. And that's what happened in France. The first couple of agents to be caught up, including Noor-Inayat Khan, tried to warn SOE in London. They left off security information on their messages back, saying, "Look, we should have said we've been blown." But SOE just sort of think, "No, it's a mistake. It's human error."
Almost shows a willing to be desperately to be there and for it to work, to overlook that vital piece of information.
I think you're right. And you can understand that, it's easy for us to sort of criticize, but they're working completely in the dark, and they're getting a message back and they're thinking, oh, we want this agent to work, but of course what it does is it ends up delivering other people into the hands of the Abwehr and the SD and SS, and it devastates SOE networks at a time when they're trying to develop that network for D-Day. Many people think that the invasion of Normandy is going to be in 1943, and the French resistance certainly feel that and hope that, and Stalin's hoping it. And, so just when it's possible that we could be trying to go back into France, a large number of networks in SOE networks are devastated. Because of the radio game, largely because of the radio game, and because of people like Dericourt, who is playing a double game exceptionally well and effectively. So then, of course, they almost have to start again in many areas of France, and that's why people like Virginia Hall end up going back in. They have a number of agents who are experienced, like Virginia Hall, who haven't been there during this period when the Prosper network and things like this have been blown, so they can go back in and start again. And they've got to start again pretty much from nothing, really, because they don't know how much is being blown of the old networks. It's hard to rejuvenate a network because you just don't know how many people have gone to ground, how many people are safe, how many people you can trust. But they do it. That period during spring and summer and then after D-Day, it's incredibly busy. It's incredibly busy. And the women are are so important during that period because of the wireless operator being so important. Because it's really about contacting London and making sure all those people in the resistance who have grown by now for various reasons are armed, I think that's the period where you could say SOE and the women agents who were there played a really, really important role in what happened.
I think their role had quite significantly changed by then. I think earlier on in the war they had visions of more James Bondy, sabotagey, and it was problematic. They got rounded up, but by later in the war, you're dropping them in, and they're actually just running ahead of the invasion troops. Because you've got the Jedburgh teams going in with them, haven't you? Who were, and it was more of actually organising a clandestine resistance movement rather than spy networks. Because you were talking, but by this time, we're talking thousands of Frenchmen were jumping onto the resistance bandwagon. So their role very much changed. As that role, as the role of what they were doing to them, did they get more hands-on?
Yes, they did. I mean, like as you alluded to there, because the resistance has changed a great deal. Particularly when the Germans started forcing French men to go and work in Germany, that really increased the number of people who joined the resistance effectively, because they wanted to go underground, and the development of the huge Maquis really developed during that period. And so for the British, broadly speaking, the British agents who are there, their roles change a lot, because they've got to organise very large numbers of people. For the women, this becomes sometimes problematic, because you have, women don't have the vote in France at the time. So the idea then that suddenly a lot of young Frenchmen want to be led by a woman, which is what happens in some areas, it's a difficult thing to get over to them. They resist that. But there's a lot of people like Nancy Wake, do have to, Elizabeth Devereux Rochester, they do have to take control of the young men in their area, say, we're in charge, we're bringing the supplies in. So women, the role does just change a great deal. And going on from the Jedburgh units and the SAS units that go in after D-Day, there are women like Nancy Wake who do actually take effectively a battlefield role, like Pearl Withington, who take a role planning attacks, in some cases leading attacks, because what they're trying to do now is, firstly, in the first weeks after D-Day, they're trying to stop German units get to Normandy, particularly the Das Reich Panzer Division coming up from the south. A lot of people are involved in trying to delay the Das Reich unit get to Normandy, because they would have been very, very important in the defence from the German point of view. And then later, they're harassing German soldiers trying to escape from Normandy. So it becomes, we get women like Nancy Wake leading attacks on Gestapo headquarters. These are incredibly brave people working in. Although the Germans are fleeing, it's very, very dangerous times, because as the Germans are fleeing, as the number of resistance attacks go up, so does the number of reprisals. And that's where you have things like Oradour and all these terrible events. And, there's no question that these people are ever going to be taken prisoner at this stage. They're going to be shot, And even the ones who were taken prisoner in the previous years, they nearly all end up being executed, sadly, because they were spies and they were treated as such.
Well, I was going to say, what was the fate if they were captured? One thing that did come across to me, I can't find my note to myself, but I was quite surprised that the Germans seemed to insist on a certain burden of proof before they would haul them off.
I think that even in a sick society such as Nazi Germany, there's this pretense, isn't there? That everybody likes a pretense at legality. I think most of these, very few of these agents talk their way out of trouble. Most of them were caught up, and once the Nacht und Nebel order came out and the commando order, once people could be just sent off to concentration camps without any questions, I think most people were more likely to be sent there than on very little evidence. The agents we're talking about, they were generally caught up as networks imploded. They weren't going to talk their way out of it. Some agents managed to get Mary Herbert, an agent who worked in France. She had a very interesting story, because she ended up falling in love with one of her comrades and had a child while she was working as an agent in France. She disappeared, when the network was being closed down. And later, when the Germans thought they'd caught up with her, they found her with her child, and they just thought, well, there's no way this person could be an agent. She's a mother with a baby. So she escaped with her life, But mostly, sadly, most of these agents who were captured ended up in concentration camps. Many weren't executed straight away. Some were executed much later on, just almost as a final act of revenge, really.
The odd one out in some respects was, in that respect, is it Odette Sanson, who 3 children, she ends up at, is it Ravensbrück?
Yes.
Saved by the camp commandant.
Yeah, well, her story, I mean, she's obviously in the book, we tried to uncover as many agents as we could who just had gone under the radar and just deserved to be remembered for all of the work that they did. Some of the wireless operators sent them 300 messages. They had incredible amount of danger. And then you got people like Odette, who became very celebrated after the war. And one of the reasons I think she became celebrated, she deserved to be celebrated, but she survived. She was there to tell her story. She was there to talk to the biographers and to the film producers, and that meant that her story was told in that sort of period of the late 40s, early 50s, where we were looking for really good war stories to tell. But Odette survived because through sheer ingenuity, really. I mean, she was captured around the area of Annecy. She worked with Peter Churchill, the agent there, and really, they had an opportunity to get away, I suppose, but they were captured by a very wily Abwehr officer. She was very, very bright in the sense that she realised that Peter Churchill's name could be of use, So she persuaded the Germans that she was married to Peter Churchill, and she was therefore related to Winston Churchill. And far from being used against her, this was something they realised, well, this is a person that we should hang on to. You never know, what use could be made. And of course, that's why the concentration camp commander kept her alive. He used her in exchange for his own life, going to find American troops at the end of the war. So she survived. It was a brilliant piece of ingenuity. Just what you can do if you...
Yeah, spin a yarn.
It's all about pretense, isn't it? And what you can do with something like that. It's fantastic, really.
Sadly, after the war, they didn't get any military recognition. Did they only get civilian awards?
A number of them were awarded the George Cross, and not as many as perhaps should have been. And then many were given an MBE or a similar kind of title, but a civil division title, which, this is going back. It's, in a way, war is a kind of revolution where social change happens, and then at the end of the revolution, the people who are in charge try and regain control, and this happens all the time, doesn't it? And I think this is what happens here, really, is that the women who had carried out these incredible jobs, many of them firing guns in anger, then get sort of civilian decorations. And people like Pearl Witherington said, there was nothing civil about what I did. We were war. This was war. And I think that it was very sad, really, that many of them didn't get the recognition they deserved. And many of the people who were foreign-born, people like Christine Granville, who was Polish-born, incredible agent, really brave, incredibly resourceful, an absolute adventurer. After the war, they didn't find a role for themselves in a way. She had a very sad life after the war, and she died in very sad circumstances. She was murdered by somebody who became obsessed with her. They didn't fit into a military structure where, okay, you've got a role now, you can stay on. They didn't fit into that structure. So they'd been through this incredibly adventurous 18 months, 2 years, more sometimes. But in civilian life, they didn't quite fit in, So it's a bit sad, really. One thing I wanted to come on to, just lastly, just thinking about paying respect to the women after in particular, is, the work that Vera Atkins did. She realised that she had sort of sent a lot of the women off into danger, and you got to bear in mind that at the end of the war, they just didn't know where these people were and what had happened to them. They had no idea. They had a rough idea that certain networks had blown. They had little bits of intelligence coming back in to say that so-and-so had been seen at so-and-so prison and all this, and Vera Atkins went to France and Germany to find out what had happened to them. And I think that was an incredible thing to do. There was a number of SOE agents who were in Germany around the time of the Nuremberg trials, trying to find out where people were. And of course, she and others were able to work out where people had spent their last months and how they had spent their last months, where they'd been executed, and obviously feed into the Nuremberg trials to try and bring war criminals where that was right to justice. I think that although in some ways the kind of the military intelligence structure almost forgot about these people, people like Buckmaster, people like Vera Atkins didn't forget about them. They'd been there and shook their hands when they left that night. They didn't forget them, and I think they spent a lot of time thinking about them. They never underestimated the great work they'd done, and they never thought lightly about what had happened to them. The terrible things that had happened to them.
Vera Atkins did account for them all, I think, didn't she, in the end?
Yeah, I think she did in the end. She worked incredibly hard, and of course she found out some of the terrible things that had happened to them. International law allowed for the execution of spies, but what happened to many of the people was barbaric, and the concentration camps were barbaric. Vera went round and she found out what happened to them, and I think that was very much to her credit, and very much to SOE's credit in a way, in the fact that although SOE was kind of disbanded and it was gone, it still tried to pay tribute to the people that had done all these things for it.
Thanks, Greg. We'll leave it there. Shadow Warriors of World War II, The Daring Women of the OSS and SOE by Greg Lewis and Gordon Thomas is available now. As ever, I'll put a link on the website, www.podcast.com. Don't forget, for the next couple of weeks, I'll have some posts on Facebook about female agents. You can find me at WWII I think that's it for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.